Lonis, cryptozoologist, is a Magic the Gathering card, obviously. I love my Lonis deck. It's a shame, since it's the most fun commander deck to pilot that I own, but I can't play it very often, as it's also the most anti-casual deck that I own, probably that I've ever seen. Note that I didn't say competitive, as it is not, by any means, competitively viable. I'll get into what I mean by that in a little bit. I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing a proper deck of the deck so that you can get an idea of it, and then spend the second half of this video waxing philosophical about it, and what playing it has taught me about Commander. Anyways, let's get into the man himself. We've got a few abilities here, the first one that stands out being his triggered ability, which most people build around. Blasting mechanized production or looping creatures for a combo. That's not really what I'm doing here though, as the activated ability is very, very fun to me for reasons outside of what you might anticipate. This little line right here is the kicker, the thing that makes the deck interesting. I'll stop being so vague about the game plan in a moment, but I feel like talking about the sorts of things I'm doing with this deck in the first few minutes of a YouTube video would catch me a toss violation. First things first, even though I said I wasn't going to build around Lonis' clue generation ability, it would be profoundly silly for me not to take advantage of it for card advantage and defeat his second ability. So most of my utility in the deck comes in the form of creatures, most of the ETB abilities that I can use to impact the game in some way or another. Naturally, since I have so many different cards that can interact with the board or gain me resources in this list of creatures, I want some ways to pull out the ones I need when I need them, as the Rec Sage doesn't really do a good job of handling Rhystic Study when it's sitting third from the bottom of my deck. Thus, we have a pod package. Birthing Pod, Prime Speaker Vannifar, and Neoform all let me find the specific card I need when I need it, and gives me an extra Lonis trigger every time. Pod is only in about 170 out of 4,500 Lonis decks at the time of writing this, which strikes me as absolutely bonkers, since it gets creatures, triggers his first ability, and gives you so much more flexibility in deck building. It lets you turn Lonis into a toolbox deck, where you get to play more reactively, and build resilience into your game plan just by having one or two copies of effects that are necessary for your deck to function properly. However, there is a much more flagrant exclusion from the average non-combo Lonis deck, that being a notorious card that can interact with his second ability. Clearly, based on EDH Rec, a lot of people are focused on manipulating their opponent's top decks with things like Memory Lapse and Gone Missing, both of which see more play than Pod in the average Lonis deck. But this is decidedly mid, as you can only have a few options to take proper advantage of Lotus' activated ability, and you can only use those options one time, reactively. The obvious route to take here, at least for me, is to put in a few cards that give you knowledge of your opponent's top decks, so that once they land, you can scoop the top card of your opponent's deck with just the right amount of clues. Lantern of Insight is a card that does exactly this. It's also very difficult to exile unless someone has both Graveyard Hate and removal that would exile it, as I can always sack it in response to removal that would otherwise exile it, then just grab it back with a Witness when I get the chance. Lantern sees play in less than 100 Lonis decks, which is tragic, as I love this card. Now we've reached the turning point of this deck tech. The thought process leading up to the divinely inspired moment of revelation that made this deck what it currently is has been replicated. We know we want to run a pod toolbox deck, and we know Lantern of Insight gives us information we can abuse with Lonis' activated ability. But what is the kicker? What makes it a war crime? What makes it the most anti-casual deck I have ever seen? Well, it's this right here. The aforementioned second half of Lonis' activated ability. The cards that you look at that you don't steal from the top go to the bottom of their owner's library. Coupled with Lantern of Insight, this denies draws. You don't even need to steal the card on top, just sack a clue and tap Lonis to make sure they don't get it. This is a Lantern control deck. If you don't know what Lantern Control is, Rhystic Studies has a lovely video about it that you could watch to catch up. But to put it as succinctly as possible, Lantern Control is a deck in Modern that seeks to get out Lantern of Insight, then 2 or 3 cards that can mill or exile the top card of a player's library, and then Ensnaring Bridge to ensure that the opponent can't attack. This is a deceptive hardlock, as with that kind of control over top decks, you simply prevent your opponent from drawing cards that could interact with your lock, then sit and do nothing until your opponent decks themselves out, or, as is much more often the case, concedes. Lantern Control is a contentious archetype, as some people think it's incredibly boring to play against, and that it takes too long. Others think it's incredibly interesting, and that Magic with perfect information allows for a degree of skill expression that you don't get to see often in this game. I, personally, think it's the most fun archetype to play against, as it's a test of managing resources and developing advantage in very small ways. Also, the idea that it takes a long time to play against is ridiculous, as you should just concede once the lock is complete. Lonis, with both Lantern and Codex Shredder, the most used mill rock I can find out of them, has a total of 7 decks on EDH Rec, one of which is mine. Adding Birthing Pod to the list brings this down to that one final deck. I also suspect that the 6 decks running Lantern package aren't leaning heavily into it as a win condition, as I figure I would have run into another deck list titled Lonis Lantern Control, or something similar in my hours of Googling about this subject. None of this really matters though, it's just incredibly important to me and my MTG hipster cred that I let everyone know that this deck composition is one of one. Lantern Control and Commander is really hard to pull off. The lock takes 4 or 5 cards in 1v1, but in a 4-player game, it requires a lot more. Ensnaring Bridge is kind of out of the question, since it would be really difficult to get this to work while you're hellbent. Thus, we use Silent Arbiter and Maze of Ith, which stops combat entirely as long as you can keep hexproof creatures off the board and untap the maze every turn. Speaking of which, the most essential piece here is Seedborn Muse, as it gives you use of the maze in each of your mill rocks on each opponent's turn. It's the only 5-drop in the deck and is the most hateable piece in the deck. Losing this makes the lock soft, and you'll have a much harder time catching a dub if it gets exiled, so try to avoid that. Common practice is to try and pod into it, so any stray counters that might have been in the cards you don't have information of from monitoring draws can't hit it. Past this is our Tutor package. We have 12 ways of getting to Lantern or Wiser than Snitches, which is the same thing on a creature, which means there's a 60% chance of seeing one in our opener, which means we can usually have a serviceable hand with a path to Lantern by our second mulligan. Many of these involve tutoring for a tutor, but you take what you can get when you need this density of lamp finders and this color identity. Trinket Mage is, of course, the all-star here.
Also, check it out. I traded a buddy for the OG Darksteel foil, and it just looks like cool as shit. I love these so much. I also have the Fabricate, and I know I wasn't talking about that when I'm interjecting here, but I just think these like blue Mirrodin foils just are the coolest looking cards in the entire game.
As he grabs Lantern, the Mill Rocks, and Expedition Map when you need to get your maze out. Worth noting that most of these are multi-purpose, and you can grab Silent Arbiter, Mill Rocks, Expedition Map, and so on when you're looking for the lock to get closed out. But obviously, Lantern comes first. The curve here is nutty. I need a high density of each mana value to get the most out of my pod effects, and low curves are just nice in general. We have a few 0-drops in here so we can pod them away for 1-drop creatures that act as Mill Rocks, like Screeching Sliver, and Cathartic Adept. Other than Mill Rock creatures, we have both Witnesses and Skullwinder. A ton of creatures that bounce our own dudes, a bunch of dudes that draw on ETB, a couple of guys that let us grab lands on ETB, Vendilion Click to scout out hands of control players who might have an answer for Seedborn Muse, Sarenth Steelseeker, which combined with Lonis lets us filter through our deck every time we play a creature, Amphin Mutineer, which lets us exile creatures on ETB, Venser, who can do a bunch of stuff here, a few specific hate pieces for tricky graveyard decks, and Displacer Kitten, which is being run for value instead of as a combo enabler for once, which is absolute insanity to me. Outside of the creatures, we have a suite of Flicker, counterspells, single target removal, and Alfheim Sanctuary, which is there only because we need a card that lets us skip our draw step if we want to really prove to our opponents that they're going to deck out before us. It's also actually not that bad when you know what you're going to draw. As for lands, I'm not running many duels, and a lot of them are tap lands. This was a budget deck initially, and I haven't had enough of an issue with this to feel the need to invest in better land, as the deck really only needs 1 pip from each color to play most of the cards in it. Counter Magic is an obvious exception, but it's not like I'm trying to play that on curve. Anyways, it's insane how much more cohesive a mana base feels when you aren't using it to cast Greedy Nonsense. The Greedy Nonsense bit is also why I'm not on Whir of Invention or Cryptic Command. They're just too blue intensive, and the mana cost is a bit too high for me. There was also a bit of a minimalist philosophy in building the deck. There's a Circuit Demir Lobotomist Lantern Control CEDH list that just uses Lantern shenanigans to stall until it can secure a Thoracle win. This goes against the spirit of Lantern Control in my opinion, as the win con should be no win con. The goal is to deck out your opponents purely by them drawing 1 card a turn and passing until the end of time. Thus, in this deck, there are no ways to go infinite, and no real way to present a meaningful threat outside of the Lantern plan. This lack of backups led me to make the deck incredibly resilient. You kinda have to take me out of the game if you want me to stop pursuing this game plan. That pretty much closes out discussion of the deck itself, as once you know the trick, it's not that difficult to see why each card in the deck is there just by reading through the deck list, which I've basically already done. But none of that really captures what I think is interesting about this deck. You see, people get really fucking mad about this thing. Not only that, but just as many people end up enamored by it, watching games that I play it in from the sidelines with an ear-to-ear grin the entire time. I distinctly remember telling the most casual player at my shop about how the deck worked, and he looked at me and asked, "Why would you do that?" As if I just told him that I went around and shot people's dogs for fun or something like that. It leaves me to wonder why this deck is despised by so many people. Creates a high skill ceiling for everyone involved. It's much more interactable than any combo deck, and it really isn't very oppressive compared to other decks that I run until the lock is actually secured. It seems like there's something unique about this that just really ruffles feathers. An obvious answer to this would be that players who don't get the game plan due to not having experience with it end up having a hard lock jumped on them seemingly randomly with a pile of draft chaff. But this is something that I corrected by being extremely vocal about how close I am to closing the game out every time I approach critical mass. I'll even give a clock for how long it's going to take me to develop into the full lock, if that's information I can feasibly have. To note, this deck is alarmingly sneaky. If I'm not transparent about what I can do with the cards I draw, or hide the land from control plan, I can easily shut the game down, seemingly out of nowhere. 2 to 3 turns of emptying hands of removal spells and shutting off draws for the decks that could stop me doesn't read as that scary for most players. And once this is done, the rest of the lot can come out uncontested and just flat out win me the game out of nowhere. I should reiterate though, this isn't how I play the deck. They have top deck information for me as well, so I try to be as transparent as possible when the combination of cards I have will lead to the lock. Another obvious answer to this could be time economy, or the amount of time you take with your game actions compared to your opponents. But since you aren't managing a dozen triggered abilities that add counters and tokens every turn, you can resolve even the most complex turns in under 2 minutes. Being smart about how you tutor for things and trying to do it while their players are taking actions and hurrying when it's your turn that you're tutoring on can cut down the amount of time that the deck wastes others by quite a bit. Also, if you're used to the play pattern, your mill rock shenanigans won't cut into the other players' turns. Obviously, when you're on the cusp of winning, you're going to be taking more time than your opponents, but this is the case with any non-combo deck. And honestly, this one is pretty tame compared to token decks, +1/+1 counter decks, storm decks, and the like. All in all, the time that I spend taking game actions tends to be lower than the time most of my opponents do when I'm playing this deck. And that's not a guess, I actually time this shit for reasons I might get into in another video. A third obvious, and this time probably accurate answer, is just that it's lantern control. But I find this horribly unsatisfying. It's like asking a kid why they don't like vegetables and being told that it's because they're yucky or something like this. It's just a circular argument. Many argue that it stops your opponent from playing the game, which is wrong in this case, as I don't care if you draw or play creatures, value engines, synergy pieces, token doublers, etc. As long as you don't draw removal, direct damage, or anything that can draw you more cards, I really don't care what you do when I'm playing this deck, and that's when I actually have the pieces to lock the entire game down. But this is an obvious misrepresentation of the statement, it stops your opponent from playing the game. I think that's shorthand for, it stops your opponents from taking meaningful actions, which is fair. The deck removes developing your board from the list of things that impact the game, and then makes it really hard to do the small list of things that can impact it after that. So that's fair. The deck sucks to play against because it stops people from making consequential actions. I can accept that. But I fail to see how this situation is any different from playing against an Ur-Dragon player who has run away with the game. Sure, you can take all the game actions you could in any other circumstance, but Dragon Danny has such an insurmountable lead that none of them actually matter. You are not making consequential actions. I personally fail to see how a Lantern Lock is any different from this, and if anything, it's actually better since I'm actively encouraging you to concede the game so we can play another. Whereas, the decorum of Commander states that I should let Dragon Danny do his thing and dirtle around for 3 more 10-minute turns before finally actually getting rid of everyone and letting us move on to a new game. And, even if I concede, my other opponents will not, so I'm stuck waiting for Danny to finish, no matter what. Pondering the Sacred Tao of the Ur-Dragon matchup after Dragon Danny slammed the table when I countered his commander for the 3rd time in the game, you can't let that shit resolve, bro. There's a list of things that you just can't allow in this game, and that's one of them. You just can't let it resolve. If he swings with that, it's over. It's fucking over. It's over. But anyway, it made me realize that I have a very similar instinctive revulsion and hate towards these sorts of dirtily mid-range piles as the people who play them have towards my Lonis deck, which is really interesting to me. I feel that my critique of them not interacting with the board past just racing to play with their fidget toy hard enough to win the game as not Magic the Gathering perfectly mirrors their critique of me not doing anything but interacting with the board and rendering their fidget toys inert as not Commander. I want to note that I don't mind playing against these kinds of decks, and if you run non-interactive mid-range piles that just dirtle around generating value until they can swing for lethal, I think that's fine. I will play cards with you, and I will be nothing but friendly while I do.
Because even though we don't love them
Gishath players,
we know how to be cordial.
But I would be lying if I said that I didn't have a sense of contempt and revulsion when seeing these decks. This might make me a bad person or something, and I can't really help it if it does. At least I'm willing to admit it, I guess. I think bringing varied perspectives into this is a good thing, and none of us really have the right to act like we're the arbiter of what people are allowed to play. We're all just trying to play the game, and it would be very silly for me or anyone else to try and enforce their vision of what makes it fun onto everyone else. But where exactly is the disconnect between what I consider fun and what other people consider fun? And what about the people who were just as enamored by the deck as I am? I think that this can be answered by looking into Mark Rosewater's Timmy, Johnny, Spike player archetypes, and adding a little bit for the specific type of player that I am. If you aren't aware of Timmy, Johnny, and Spike, don't worry about it too much, I'll explain it as I go. But you should totally read Mark Rosewater's articles about these player archetypes whenever you get the chance. See, for me, I like decisions. The more decisions I can make in a Magic the Gathering game, the more fun I'm having. I love playing control for this reason. I try to play low curves and at instant speed so that I can do my decision making throughout the whole turn cycle, and so I have more options on what to play during this. I'll shove Sensei's Divining Top into any deck I can justify its presence solely to be able to make more decisions. My favorite kind of decisions are small ones that gradually compound into a big advantage, which is probably why I like this deck so much. See, it's so incredibly full of decisions for me to make that I feel invested in the game in a way that I don't with any other deck. Every single draw from every single player is a decision, every tutor is a decision, etc., etc. I feel like I'm playing a game in a very meaningful way when I do this, and on top of this, the deck creates novel decisions for other players. When you know that your draws are controlled, you have to think about how you use your resources. It's like a survival horror game, where resource management is the most important part of the game. Most of the players that express frustration with this deck are what I would classify as Timmies, and I'm not using that phrase as a slur. It's 2025. It's alright to like big flashy plays. For the uninitiated, Timmy likes to make big plays. He likes to see big things happen. He lives for resolving 10 drops and swinging the game with them. But this is a reductive way to look at these players. Most Timmies in Commander have a bit of a Johnny streak about them, Johnny being the archetype that plays to express himself through play and deck building. He lives for synergy. So the average player I'm talking about here likes to make big flashy plays and likes them to be built synergistically. They want to drop Ur Dragon onto a field of dragons, draw a bunch of cards, and then dump their hand to generate more value. I imagine it feels like heroin to them. We have a third archetype too, though. That's Spike, and he, very simply, likes to win. I think this is a minimization of Spike, though, even though it's pretty much the entirety of Spike's identity based upon his inventor, Mark Rosewater. I have a definite spiky streak, but it doesn't manifest as me putting a ton of value on victory. A 25% win rate in Commander is normal, after all. For me, my spikiness comes down to a love of the game. I mean the actual game. The competitive game. Game theory, John Nash, prisoner dilemma shit. I want to make meaningful decisions and not just let my deck play itself. I want to compete with my opponents meaningfully, and I expect to lose pretty frequently because it's a 4-player format. I don't really get as much out of winning the game as I do having a game that feels stimulating, where all the players are firing on all cylinders and dealing with each other's threats in clever ways. My Johnny streak is represented as me being a huge MTG hipster. It satisfies me to no end knowing the decks that I play and the play patterns I fall into are unique enough to draw comments about it from other players. These Johnny tendencies can mildly irritate people who aren't used to weird off-meta nonsense, but this type of spikiness is extremely at odds with the Timmy Johnny discussed. As understanding the threat that the Ur Dragon presents, I am going to find a way to intelligently deal with it and keep them from doing their thing. This is anti-casual. I personally see this as a casual and fun way of playing the game, but the majority of players don't really jive with it in the same way I do. Instead of seeing me challenging them doing the thing as a conversation in the language of the game that they can continue by playing around my challenge, they see it as an attack on the sanctity of what makes Commander Commander. Though I might find it exhilarating when someone removes the piece that was going to win me the game, forcing me to find a way to continue without it, some people see that as a personal attack that ruins their fun. Finding a good balance of playing like this and letting people do their thing has become integral to the way that I build decks. The Lonis deck is particularly anti-casual because it not only stops someone from doing their thing, but it does so in a way that doesn't appear to be doing a thing at all. Most people don't see me doing this type of shit as something that could be intrinsically fun, even if to me, dealing with multiple instant speed draw abilities by responding to them with the mill rocks, having them respond back with another draw, and repeating this procedure is the highest form of Magic the Gathering, and it feels like a battle of wits. To them, it's just me being a dick. And even if to me, finding a way to deal with the graveyard deck that doesn't really care about my mill rocks is a really interesting challenge in gameplay, to them, it's me targeting them and being rude. On top of this, the deck doesn't have a very exciting vibe. Some people can get really excited over control elements when it feels like the person doing them is some sort of evil villain, or like they're some thick glasses wearing anime character that uses their encyclopedic knowledge to find the perfect tool to handle the big scary threat at the table. This deck is neither of those things. The vibe is more like watching a 45-minute unedited video of an anaconda killing a deer. The feel is not exciting, it's that of inevitability. It's not to say the deck is boring on a mechanical level, which we've already discussed, but the vibe definitely isn't hype, and unless you're a huge nerd about this shit like I am, the vibe's actually really important. The joy that I feel from playing this deck is lost on people who don't appreciate the game on the same axes that I do, just as the joy they feel from doing the Ur Dragon thing is lost on me. The deck actively pisses these types of players off because they see it as an object of malice towards others instead of as a love letter to the act of playing the game, which is how I see it. The fact that other people have recognized it as a love letter to the act of playing the game is probably the only reason I haven't taken it apart. I'm definitely not alone in the way I perceive the game, though I'm definitely a minority. I think understanding these different perspectives and trying to build decks and play them in a way that lets everyone have fun in the way they organically do should probably be the highest goal of Commander. In this respect, Lonis was an absolute failure, as it's incredibly polarizing, and leads to games that really piss off a certain group of players. This delegates the deck to a sort of dessert option, where I only play it as a little treat to myself and avoid pulling it out in the wrong pods. There are definitely groups of people that will tolerate or even revel in the play patterns that this deck creates, but it's something that needs to be assessed on the fly and figured out as you go. Understanding player profiles and variance in what people like about the game and how they apply to the way people have fun is probably the best way to get more mileage out of your enjoyment of the Commander format. Blind pickup games where you don't know what anyone is playing or the metas that they come from can be fun in a sort of old UFC cage fight sort of way, but tailoring your decks to the meta that you play in and finding ways to do things that you enjoy that also add to the fun of the people you regularly play with is, without a doubt, the best way to have fun in this format. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think a lot of videos and articles about Commander focus on making a better or more tuned deck. And as far as I'm concerned, making a good and tuned casual Commander deck isn't actually terribly difficult for an enfranchised player. The challenge comes in when you have to figure out how to build a good, tuned, and fun deck. I want to talk about this in the future. Ideas about time economy, play patterns that you can lean into to create interesting narratives in your games, cards that lead to shitty experiences for players, and cards that lead to really positive ones. This is my first video about Magic the Gathering, and I wanted to start by talking about this deck, as it's a really good starting point for having conversations like this. Playing it really concretized a lot of the ideas about how people experience this game for me, and being able to talk through that thought process has hopefully given you some fresh ideas about the format, and some new ways to view your own deck building and play. Anyways, I love this deck, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about it. If you want more videos like this in the future, go ahead and feed Moloch by liking, commenting, subscribing, or whatever other thing you want to do to interact with this video. Thanks!